Sometimes when people find out that I build furniture, they'll say things like, "You must hate IKEA." And I don't. I think IKEA is great. But I guess what I'm trying to say is, Hopin, you've served us well, but it's time. Alright, this is going to be a pretty in-depth build with a lot going on, so I'm going to try my best to keep everything really well organized and easy to understand. And hopefully I can even impart a few tips along the way. We'll see. But if nothing else, hopefully it at least entertains you and maybe even triggers a few ideas of your own. Okay, so with everything in the shop, the first thing we're going to do is put our cabinet together. And I know it's always hard to follow along with this step because everything looks essentially the same. So let's start with an animation that'll provide a bit more clarity. Our cabinet's going to consist of 8 pieces, a bottom, top, and 2 sides obviously. To that, we'll add 2 vertical partitions and 2 adjustable shelves. This big section here is going to house 3 drawers, and doors will cover the 2 side cubbies. As for joinery, the sides are going to sit in rabbets, and the vertical partitions will sit in some dados. Finally, along the back of the sides and the top and bottom pieces, we'll cut more rabbets to receive a back panel. To cut everything to size, you could use whatever you like, but I'm going to be using a combination of my Kreg ACS for some of the larger panels and cross-cutting and ripping the rest over at the table saw. The only thing to note here is that I'm not finalizing anything just yet, just getting close to the finished dimensions. In the finished piece, I'm not going to want any of my plywood edges showing, so the next step is to cut some thin strips of walnut that I can use to edge band anything that would be visible. After everything was dry, I trimmed away the excess hardwood for most of the pieces using a jig over at the table saw. But a few of the panels were too big to use there, so I used a router with a flush trim bit. Next, we need to cut our rabbets into both ends of the top and bottom panels. And the bulk of this is going to be determined by one cut. So once I've got my fence set to where it needs to be and my blade to where I want it, I'm going to make a cut on a scrap piece of plywood that's the same thickness as my actual pieces. Once I felt like that was dialed in, I could go ahead and make my 4 cuts. Next, I'm going to raise my blade and make another cut on my test piece. And once that's good, again, I can make the real cuts. Here I'm marking out where I want my dados to be in the top and bottom panels. To make the cuts, I'm going to use the 1/8 inch drill bit trick that Sean taught me, which I went over in detail in another video, so if you want to see that, I'll put a link in the description. In any case, once I'd established the width, I could clear out the remaining material. Next, I'm going to cut all of the panels to their final widths. And I'm going for a pretty shallow dresser, only about 15 inches deep. And the reason for that is I'll gain a few inches in the walkway between the foot of our bed and the dresser, which is pretty tight at the moment. Before we assemble the case, I'm going to cut some shelf pinholes into the cabinet sides and the vertical partitions. And here I'm just making sure that the center hole is dead center on each panel. And I'll need to pay attention to this when I go to cut my vertical partitions to their finished length in a few steps. Just making sure that I'm removing approximately the same amount of material from the top and the bottom of the panel, so that the center stays center. Finally, we can cut our rabbets along the back edges of the top, bottom, and side pieces. And one of the nice things here is that these can be full width since the sides are going to cover any gaps that might have shown. For assembling the case, there's no real trick. I'm just using every square and right angle tool that I have pretty much, just to try to keep things nice and square as I assemble them and as the glue dries. And that's going to make things a lot easier as I install the drawers and doors in a bit. Okay, so now we can set our cabinet aside for a bit so that we can get to work on the drawers and doors. Here I've got 3 pieces of maple that I'm milling and gluing up into one big panel that's about 6'5" by 17 inches. Or just slightly larger than the entire opening that the drawers and doors is going to cover. And the reason for that is I want the grain to look continuous as it flows from the left door to the drawer faces and finally to the right door. And once we get these glued up, I'm going to call it a day. The next morning I could get to work on making the drawer boxes. Now, this was my first time using the Bloom tandem drawer slides on my own, so I had some hesitations. And I really double and triple checked all of my numbers to make sure that I nail things the first go around. And I'm not going to go over this part in detail because honestly it's worthy of an entire video dedicated to just that part of the build. So if you'd like to see a video that goes over it in detail, there's a video on Sean's old channel and I'll throw a link in the description so you can go check it out after this one. The only extra thing that I'll say is this. These drawer slides actually seem more difficult than they are, and once you have them in, they are seriously really nice. They're really smooth, really easy to take in and out, and at the end of the day I'd say it's worth it. It's definitely a step up. Also, I'm not one to ever say that you need to have something, but if you do use these drawer slides, this little jig from Rockler is worth its weight in gold. It helps you perfectly position some of the crucial drilling spots, and in my opinion, it's kind of a no-brainer. Okay, with the drawer boxes in and our panel dry, we could turn our attention back to the doors and drawer faces. I started off by doing a lot of marking to determine where my drawer faces would start and stop and where I'd need to cut my doors and so forth. And once I felt like I had my head wrapped around it, I could start cutting. I started with the doors, so here I'm cutting off a chunk from each side of the panel, which is going to become the 2 doors. Once they were cut to their finished size, I could attach the hardware. And to mortise that out, instead of using my drill press, I'm going to use this Kreg jig that works with a drill. And I think it's actually easier to use this jig than a drill press, unless you have a jig that's set up to perfectly position things. That would obviously be the fastest, but with only 4 hinges to install, I'd say that this is quicker. Next up was the drawer faces, and this was essentially more of the same. I started by marking out the length that I need to cut the entire panel to, making that cut, and then using my marks that I had made on the vertical partition to work my way up, installing the bottom face first, then the middle, and finally the top. So while I work my way through that, I'd like to take a second to thank Ruben Duarte, Caleb Schaefer, Tobias Korsback, Zed Moore, Freeman Woodworking, Luke Wilson, and the rest of my Patreon members for making these videos possible. Your t-shirts are in the mail as a token of my appreciation, but I know that that isn't enough, so I'll say it again. Seriously, thank you for showing me the generosity that you have and for enabling me to be able to do this as a job. It truly is a dream come true. And I mean this quite literally when I say that I couldn't be doing this without you. So again, thank you. And if you want to support the show too, click on the Patreon link in the description, check it out, and see if it's right for you. And as always, no pressure. Okay, just when you thought we were done with drawers and doors, nope, still gotta make the handles. So here I've got a piece of MDF that I'm drawing a cutout into. And we're gonna use this as a template so that we can make them all identical. Once I was happy with the template, I traced it out onto the drawer fronts and then used a jigsaw to remove the bulk of the material and a router to cut the final shape into the fronts. Once those were done, I did the same thing to the doors. Finally, I put a round over on all the drawer fronts and doors just to try out something different. And I ended up really liking it, so this is something that I'm definitely going to do more of moving forward. Okay, finally the cabinet is done and we can make our base, or legs. Now again here we're going to be creating some templates to help keep things nice and consistent. And you might remember in my last video for the Silver Fox coffee table, I went over how I made my templates using a track saw, bandsaw, rasps, and sanders. But if you happen to have a CNC, this is the perfect opportunity to put it to use. So that's what I'm going to do. But again, if you do want to see the manual version, that's covered in the coffee table video, so I'll have another link in the description. Out of the CNC, I got this shape, which is a leg, and this shape, which is half of the stretcher. So the first thing that I'm going to do is manually duplicate the stretcher piece. And then I'm going to use a couple dominoes and some glue to make myself one big stretcher, which was too big to cut on the CNC. From there, I got a general sense of where my various pieces would come from, and then cut my walnut into some smaller chunks so that I could mill it to its final thickness of right around 1.5 inches thick. Now, that of course erased the lines that I had drawn, so I traced them again, this time for reals, and then used my bandsaw and jigsaw to rough out the general shapes, leaving them just a little bit oversized at this point. You'll notice in some of these shots that I'm leaving some large blocky portions on the pieces, and those are going to be used as clamping spots, which you'll see in a minute. Now I'm going to use my template and a flush trim bit to start refining things a little. But I'm actually looking to do the least amount of cutting possible at this point. Really what I'm aiming for is to establish one good reference face on each piece. That way I can get the pieces onto a sled over at the table saw in a still relatively rough state to cut the joint faces. And that's what we're going to do next. The next day I started off at the bandsaw, cutting off the clamping spots I had previously left on, and then did some more template routing. Now, the night before I actually took my template pieces and joined them together, like this. And the whole purpose of doing this and leaving the extra material up until this point is because that's the easiest way to get a really nice clean transition where the pieces join together. I used to try to do it where I'd cut out the entire finished shapes and then glue those together, and it works, but it just doesn't come out as clean. And you end up spending a ton of time sanding in hard to reach areas to try to fix the problems that you created. So I'd say this is definitely the way to go. To attach the sub-assemblies together, I'm going to make 5 connecting pieces. So here I'm ripping some walnut scraps to about 2 inches wide and then cross-cutting them to about 9 3/4 inches long. For the 2 pieces that will attach on the lower part of the leg, I'm going to use some dominoes. Once they were cut into the ends of each of the pieces, I marked out on the leg exactly where they need to be positioned and then made those cuts. For the pieces that'll connect on the underside of the cabinet and aren't really visible, I'm going to use pocket holes. And the reason for that is they're just a lot quicker and easier. And if this were for a client, I probably would have used all dominoes, but since the client's me, he can go f*** himself. To attach the base to the top, I'm going to use 4 of these figure 8 desktop fasteners. So here I'm just mortising them in, and then we'll attach them once we get everything home. At the beginning of the video, I mentioned IKEA, and how people think that I must despise IKEA when they find out that I build furniture. And as I said at the top, I don't. In fact, I'd say the only thing I don't like about IKEA is going there. But that's just because I pretty much dislike going anywhere. So don't take it too hard, IKEA. I suppose where some people might have a problem is they think that IKEA and the like have ruined people's perception of the cost of furniture. If you build custom furniture, you know what I'm talking about. A project might have material costs of $300 and require 40 man-hours to build, and yet somehow the customer has an expectation that the total cost is going to be $600. Sure, that can be aggravating, but my stance was always, those aren't really the clients you want to be dealing with anyway. And the more that you do it, the better you get at sniffing them out, and the less time you'll waste. But back to IKEA. I think a lot of their designs are phenomenal, regardless of price. Take something like the Poeng armchair. If I designed and built that, I'd be thrilled. In fact, if it weren't an IKEA product and people saw that on my channel, I'd wager that I'd get a lot of comments from people saying that that was the best work I've done. So I guess my point is, you can be into fine furniture and design and still like and respect IKEA. I mean, it might even be all the more reason to like and respect them. And for as great as any one of us thinks that they might be at designing and building furniture, remember this. Making things like Poeng, Billy, or Klimpin ain't easy. Not to mention meatballs. Thanks for watching, liking, and subscribing, and I'll see you in the next one.